Goslar won the flip. Tapped Breeding Pool on turn 1 versus tapped Gruul Gate for Sasser. Goslar will shock for a Water Grave, and here's an Incubation Druid.
I'll tell you this much. The Sultai Climb deck, this is a much more aggressively slanted version of the Sultai mid-range decks that you're used to seeing. And if you want to see a Sultai deck that can potentially take down this Nexus of Gates deck, this is one of them for sure. That aggressive tilt, something like Hadana's Climb, can close the game in a hurry and potentially make it so that the Nexus of Gate deck doesn't have time to get online. And as a mid-range deck, that's exactly where you need to be.
Tapped Breeding Pool for Sasser. Goslar's going to cast a Jadelight Ranger, put a Zagana Utopian Speaker into the graveyard. He's got a 4/3 Jadelight Ranger. Druids were going to tap here for a Growth Chamber Guardian before the Jadelight Ranger comes across for 4, Sasser to 16.
Yeah, this is quite a bit of pressure here from Matthew's side of things. The big Jadelight Ranger off of the 2-spell Scry, followed by a Growth Chamber Guardian. You know, this is 8 damage potentially next turn.
Plaza
Maybe
Harmony
more.
for Sasser. You go to 19.
Yeah, Sasser's going to go get some lands here at 19 life, feeling pretty safe. But Jadelight Ranger plus Growth Chamber Guardian and potentially even Incubation Druid, putting that adept counters on it. Coming over for 11. Put Drake Sasser all the way down to 8.
Yeah, circuitous route there. Sasser now will have at least 6 mana on the following turn. Goslar takes the opportunity to grow that Growth Chamber Guardian up to a 4/4. Go find another copy of that.
Now, this is a spot where it's possible Goslar is able to get his creatures big enough where something like Gates of Blaze doesn't get the job done. There's a Plaza Harmony as well as a Breeding Pool on the battlefield. Only 4 gates right now, and that Incubation Druid currently has 5 toughness.
It's good enough for the other creatures, though. Goslar did shock to 16 for that play. His life total is not the most relevant thing. Kind of we're talking about is Sasser kind of needs Gates of Blaze now.
Yeah, I mean, if he doesn't have Gates of Blaze now, if he just goes something like Wilderness Reclamation into Expansion Explosion, that's not really enough. You know, maybe takes care of 1 creature. But this is really where the deck starts to kind of fall apart. But it looks like he has Time Walk here in the Nexus of Fate. Take an extra turn and see what happens. Gets an extra draw step, gets to play an extra land, and could potentially find that gate number 5 to take down the Incubation Druid if he already has that Gates of Blaze.
Yeah, and the land that turn was Plaza of Harmony, so he's at 11. That is the amount of power that Goslar has, so we'll need to figure something out here. It's like Forest is the land. Tap of 8 mana. Looks like he's thinking about Explosion, probably on the Growth Chamber Guardian. And he's going to pass. You can do that one at instant speed, though it's a little ambitious to do that against a blue deck, but you can do it.
Yeah, I just don't think that there's that much of a downside, and if he draws up enough cards, he could potentially... that's not how that works, unfortunately, but we're going to get some clarification on this, but there are 2 targets for Expansion Explosion. One is the creature, and one is the player that draws the cards. Unfortunately for Goslar, he's going to target his own creature with Cast Down in an attempt to counter the explosion, but unfortunately for him, Drake Sasser still going to get to draw those 4 cards.
Yep.
This is, of course, just something that happens on occasion, a little bit of unfamiliarity with new cards like Expansion Explosion. In the past, effects like that haven't had 2 targets, but the construction of Expansion Explosion is there, namely so that something like that can't happen. When you spend 8 mana on a spell, you expect to get the full value out of it, unless it gets hit with a counter spell, of course.
Yeah, other creatures do come across. Sasser's at 4. Goslar's going to play a Water Grave, shocking to 14. And is a hostage taker on his own Jadelight Ranger. That's interesting. He can cover that against a Gates of Blaze.
Right, and now even if Drake Sasser does have Gates of Blaze, Goslar is going to be left with a Jadelight Ranger on the battlefield still. So Sasser is going to look to potentially kill the hostage taker before casting Gates of Blaze, or just go a different route entirely and try to go ham sandwich with a Wilderness Reclamation and maybe a couple of strings of Nexus of Fates.
Simic Guildgate is where Sasser will start on this turn. Wilderness Reclamation, there's 4 mana. There's a Hydroid Krasis, X equals 2. Gain a life, draw a card. Get those counters on the creature, not the Reclamation. Sasser to 5, untap his lands. Want to say there was another Explosion in hand, but how about this? Nexus of Fate.
Yeah, this is a big deal, and I think Sasser actually about to win the game next turn, really showing off just how powerful this deck can be. After drawing that big burst of cards last turn, he goes Wilderness Reclamation into just a paltry 2/2, but he gets to untap, attack for 2, float a bajillion mana during his end step, and cast one of the biggest explosions I've ever seen. I'm lying, I've done it for way more.
It's for enough.
It is for enough, and you know what? There's no difference between 10, 20, and 50.
Winning is winning.
When you win the game.
Yes. And Sasser does just that. Big explosion, up a game over Matthew Goslar.
Yeah, and not quite the most aggressive start from Goslar, and no real disruption, just drawing, things like Hostage Taker, Jade Light Ranger, and that's exactly where you want to be on the Nexus of Gate side of things. You want your opponent to draw the cards that are good against the aggro decks and not the ones that are good against your mid-rangey, big explosive combo deck. And now Sasser potentially going to board into a completely different deck. Thanks to things like Gatebreaker Ram, Niv Mizzet Peyrune, and Archway Angel, it's possible that all of the Wilderness Reclamations are gone after Game 1. All of the really cheeky cards like the Nexus of Fates that are only really good once you have the Wilderness Reclamation going, those could just be no longer in his deck, and then the Sultai Climb deck is left trying to play a bunch of disenchant type effects that just no longer are effective.
And that's just such a cool innovation that we've seen in practice this weekend. The Nexus of Gates deck that also just has the non-Nexus, just the Ram kind of package in tow. Of course, they're going to be leaving in the Nexuses either way, but it's sort of a transformational cyborg kind of thing between the two sort of Gate strategies we've seen so far.
Right, and it's important to note that Gatebreaker Ram, in a lot of ways, in a lot of respects, plays out a lot like Thief of Sanity, where if your opponent doesn't kill it, there's a good chance it just single-handedly wins the game. When it enters the battlefield, it's usually somewhere around a 4/4 or 5/5, and then it just gets continually bigger and presents more and more threatening scenarios for the opponent. And when you back that up against like a control deck or even the mirror match with 4 copies of Negate out of the sideboard, as well as 4 copies of Expansion that can potentially counter a counter spell, you're looking at a 3 mana threat that can potentially win the game all on its own.
And there's some matchups where it's just even better than something like Thief of Sanity in that role. For example, against Drakes. That deck just can almost never kill Gatebreaker Ram. If you're patient with it, give it enough toughness before you deploy it, it can just run away with all of those games.
Right, and that sideboard plan, that transformational sideboard plan featuring Gatebreaker Ram is useful in so many matchups. And in Game 1, you want to be as explosive as possible because people's decks are a little more slanted towards beating aggressive decks with a bunch of spot removal. But after sideboard, a lot of that spot removal goes away, and Gatebreaker Ram runs rampant.
Goslar's online here with turn 1 Llanowar Elves, and a turn 2 Jade Light Ranger puts another elf into the graveyard and draws a land. Sasser just a couple guild gates to start. That's about what you expect, though.
Yeah, duress here from Goslar on turn 3 to start. Looking at a couple of Gates Ablaze, that's scary, as well as a couple of Gatebreaker Rams, a Guild Summon, and a Nexus of Fate. I'm actually pretty surprised to see Nexus of Fate still in the deck, but I'm also just very curious how Sasser decided to sideboard.
Yeah, could be trimmed. We don't know. Guild Summit was the take with the duress. Sasser probably wants to draw a couple lands to make this hand a little better, but he does have that Guild Gate that'll turn Gates Ablaze online next turn anyway.
Right. I'm actually pretty surprised Goslar chose Guild Summit over Gates Ablaze, simply because, I guess he has, I don't know what. I guess he just has a bunch of follow-up creatures. Because the Gates Ablaze for me is a lot scarier than a card draw engine. Like, you really need to make sure that your pressure is still online.
It could just be a thing because there was redundant copies of Gates Ablaze, though. Speaking of redundant copies, here's a Guild Summit for Sasser.
Yeah, and that's a huge draw from him. And now he has another Gates Ablaze that he can deploy over the next few turns if necessary, as well as that card draw engine that's online.
Growth Chamber Guardian was played last turn for Goslar, and this turn it's going to knock Sasser down to 10. See what else he can deploy. He does need to do a bit of resetting into a Gates Ablaze that he knows about.
Yeah, it's pretty scary.
Ooh,
that's an Unmoored Ego. That's a sideboard card here from Goslar, and that one's going to choose, it looks like Gatebreaker Ram. It's going to steal a few copies out of Drake Sasser's hand. If we get Unmoored Ego on the screen, I believe that's the one where if it steals them out of your opponent's hand,
they get to redraw
the card. So he's going to get to draw 2 cards off of it, so not as much of a feel bad, right, as some of those cards can be sometimes. But for only 3 mana and the ability to name a non-basic land, Unmoored Ego has started to show up in some modern decks sideboards as a means of stripping people away from those cards.
It's the kind of situation where if it was cranial extraction, you'd feel really good about that for Goslar. But the fact that it just took care of Gatebreaker Ram, just one of a number of possible win conditions with a hand with multiple gates ablaze for Sasser, I really don't like Goslar's position here as this Vivian Raid gets hit by a negate.
No, I'm even Goslar is suffering from just not having the right answer to the right cards from Jake Sasser. He's able to take the Gatebreaker Rams, sure, right? He's able to, the problem is all of his threats got swept by the Gates of Blaze. If he had used Unmoored Ego instead of Duress on the turn, where